Now that we've established the general notions about the Crusades and the Crusaders and the Holy Land, the next question should be, why did the Crusaders come from Europe to the Holy Land? And why did it happen at the time it happened? There are different motivations and reasons given by modern scholars to the enormous event that we call the Crusades. So obviously, one of the main reasons would be the religious motivation, and that would be freeing the Holy Land, the holy city of Jerusalem, and the Holy Sepulchre Church from the hands of the Muslims. Why around the 11th century? Well, it has something to do with the fact that around the year 1000, many people in Europe expected and anticipated the second coming of the Messiah, the second coming of Jesus. Now, Jesus didn't come around the year 1000, and many were disappointed, but more Christians believed that perhaps they made the wrong calculation. Maybe they should have counted not from the time of the birth of Jesus, that would bring us from the year around -4 BC to the year 1000, but perhaps we should count the years, the 1000-year period, from the death, from the crucifixion, which is supposedly around the year 30 or 33 AD. That brings us to the middle of the first half of the 11th century. And yet again, it didn't happen. People, I guess, may have been disappointed, but others still believed that, yes, maybe we made the right calculation, but we're not worthy of the second coming. Maybe we should repent to allow for Jesus to come back. Maybe there are some conditions that have to be fulfilled. So the basic idea is that even though the expectations for the second coming were not fulfilled around the year 1000, that doesn't mean that the messianic tension ceased to exist. It was still in the air. So that's one thing we need to remember. The other thing we need to remember is the fact that in the year 1009, a real disaster happened in the Holy Land. In those days, a Muslim ruler named El-Hakim bi-Amrillah, the ruler by the decree of God. It is a rough translation of the title he had. He was a Shiite Muslim non-tolerant leader around the year 1000 who persecuted the Christians. He destroyed churches. He persecuted the Christians themselves in Egypt and other places too. One of the churches that he totally demolished because it became a symbol of the presence of Christianity in the Holy Land was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the place where Jesus was, according to tradition, held by many Christian denominations till this day, the place where Jesus was crucified, buried, and resurrected. So the Holy Sepulchre Church was totally demolished according to the sources at the time. News about that obviously reached Europe. Mind you, the fact that the Holy Land is under Muslim control around the year 1000 doesn't mean that Christians don't come here. There was tourism, perhaps not as it is today, but there was tourism, trade, and knowledge and rumors about what happens in the Holy Land reached Europe quite easily. So hearing about the disaster, mixing it with the anticipation for the second coming of the Messiah, that must have fed the sentiments that eventually led to the First Crusade. But is this enough? Is this the entire explanation? As it happens, it seems that the full explanation is more complicated. And the other part of the explanation is the economic aspect. There's European economic interest in the East. Now, what I'm going to say now isn't really relevant to the First Crusade, but it will be extremely important to understand the survival of the Crusaders in the Holy Land once they got to the Holy Land. And I'm talking about mainly the trade with the Middle East, focusing on merchandise such as the spice trade, the trade of sugar, and other commodities as well. Let's take a look at the spice trade, for instance. When we think about spices, what is the purpose of spices? Well, there are different uses of spices in Europe at the time. For instance, spices are used in churches. Spices are used in medicine. Different spices were considered to have healing properties. Spices were used as preservatives for food. In times where there are no refrigerators, it's very important. And there were other uses of spices. So this is a very valuable commodity. Now, even before the Crusaders, spices were indeed exported from the Middle East to Europe, to the West. But think about what happens when the Crusaders are now in control in the Holy Land. They basically control the entire route from the production site, which is the Holy Land, up to the ports in Europe. So this would be a great economic interest in the Middle East. And indeed, as we will see, several naval cities in Europe, such as Genova, Venice, London, Marseille in France, all these cities became extremely focused on the trade with the Middle East. And their one important interest was to keep the Crusader control of the harbors in the Holy Land. But that's also not the entire picture. You see, in the 11th century, Europe was different than Europe in the 10th century, 100 years earlier. You see, in the 10th century, Europe was still under the impression and the effect of the barbaric invasions to Europe in the 9th century, the 10th century. It was an age of wars, age of demolition, age of pain and suffering. By the 11th century, things begin to settle down. It's not a peaceful time, but it's relatively more peaceful than in the past. Less people get killed. That's the important point here, you see. Beyond that, the 11th century is witness to the introduction of new technologies to the field of agriculture, such as the introduction on large scale of heavy plows made of iron. Now, heavy plows enable the farmer to cultivate lands that were inaccessible until then. So more areas are now cultivated, the more food is produced, and therefore the population begins to grow. Some scholars even suggest that the population of Europe doubled itself since the beginning of the 10th century to the end of the 11th century. So basically there are too many people and not enough space. You may think, not enough space? In the huge area of Europe, not enough space? How could it be? Well, you must remember, Europe that you know today is nothing like Europe in the 11th century. Most of Europe in the 11th century was still forests. So one had to actually invest a huge effort in preparing the land, cultivating it, and producing more food. So a better solution would be to solve this demographic pressure by actually diverting people from Europe to the East. In a sense, one may look at the Crusades from that perspective as a pressure valve which is open, allowing the demographic pressure to be released to the East. Once people move on to the East, there will be less people in Europe, less pressure, less wars over water and fields, and that would bring more peace. That was one set of mind that some people in Europe thought along. So demographic pressure, religious aspirations, there were more reasons for the First Crusade to begin, but the question is, why did the Crusades leave Europe the First Crusade, in the year 1096 and not, say, in 1050 or in 1315? What was so unique at the end of the 11th century? Well, you see, sometimes you have all the components in a bomb and all you need is the fuse. And the fuse, and that's the important point here, is the political motivation. The political motivation and the geopolitical setting of the end of the 11th century. Let me explain. By the end of the 11th century, in around the year 1095, on March 1095, Pope Urban II, he was the Pope back then, receives a letter from Alexius, Emperor Alexius, the Emperor of the Byzantine Empire. In his letter, the Emperor complains about the pressure he feels from the Muslims. They're invading our country, he says, and seeks for help from Europe. Why didn't the Byzantine Emperor address one of the kings of Europe? I guess he felt that if he addresses the Pope is a unifying force, he is the head of the Christian church, it would be a better idea. The Pope is the one who could actually bring together all the princes and barons and kings in Europe to help the Byzantines. As it happened, Pope Urban II held the letter, not saying any word about it, for a couple of months, until an assembly of the kings and princes and leaders gathered in a place called Clermont in France. That happened in November 1095. It's the end of the year. So all of the celebrities gathering at that gathering, each one made a speech, and Pope Urban II waited for the last day of the gathering. And on the last day, he stands up and he makes a speech which is going to change the history of the Middle East for the next 200 years. Obviously, he didn't know that, but that's exactly what happened. This is the famous speech of Clermont, in which he urges the kings and princes to gather together, to join forces, help the Christians in the East, in the Byzantine Empire, and use this opportunity to go beyond the Byzantine Empire, invade the Holy Land, free Jerusalem, and free the Holy Sepulchre. Now, the question is, why did the Pope do that? Obviously, he used the opportunity to strengthen his own status, his own power in the West. Mind you, papacy in the 13th, 14th century was very strong, but not in the 11th century. The papacy suffered from several blows in the 11th century. For instance, in 1054, that's merely 40 years before the Clermont gathering, in 1054, the Christian world was divided, hence it was called the Great Schism, the Great Division, between the Catholics in the West and the Eastern Christians in the East, in the Byzantine Empire. Pope Urban II believed he had to be the leader of the Christian church. The fact that now there are two churches, practically, meant that he only rules the West. He believed, I think, that it is still possible to turn the wheel back. If he accepts the challenge of unifying Christians to help their brothers in the East, he will be associated with a great victory. Moreover, if he manages to bring Christianity back to the Holy Land, he will be held responsible for the glorious achievement, and everyone will acknowledge his superiority. Unfortunately, Pope Urban II never wrote a diary, so I can't prove what I just said, but it seems a plausible reconstruction of his set of mind in accepting the challenge and in deciding to urge the West, to help the East, and eventually gain control over Jerusalem. As I said, Pope Urban II could not anticipate the great success of his call in the famous speech of Clermont. He believed that this is just the beginning, that he has to do more work in persuading Christians to actually march to the Holy Land. So, leaders of the church everywhere, in their sermons on Sundays, pressed that point and expressed the notion that a good Christian should follow the Pope's call and go to the Holy Land. There were others who helped the Pope. He didn't know about them, I guess. They were ordinary priests, such as one named Peter the Hermit. Peter the Hermit was a humble priest who was a great orator, who was a great speaker. And sources of the time speak about him reverently as someone who goes to the villages, to the ordinary people, speaking about Jesus' love, promising heaven, and persuading people to follow the call of the Pope. And as a result, something unbelievable happened, something that was not anticipated by anyone. During May and July, until July 1096, a couple of months after the Pope's call, a spontaneous crusade begins to arrange all over Europe, mainly in the cities of Germany. We hear about the Crusades. These peasants are the Crusaders. They're not warriors. They're not knights. Simple peasants. People who live in their land for generations. They decide to leave whatever they do, take whatever makeshift weapon they can arrange, and start marching to the Holy Land. Groups moving from different places, swarming along the main rivers. The general direction would be the east. That's everything they know. They have no idea where they're going. Their leaders are low-ranking knights, sometimes even not that. And they're going along the way to Jerusalem, not knowing where Jerusalem is located. There are descriptions of these people approaching a city in France or in Germany, looking at the castles, at the walls, and asking each other, is this Jerusalem? Have we reached our destiny? So they have no knowledge about geography, about the sea they have to cross, but they walk because they believe. And on the way, when they get to places, to great cities in Germany, for instance, they look around them and suddenly they notice something they haven't seen in their villages. Jews. There are Jewish communities all over Germany at the time. And these Jews live with the Christians. They're part of the medieval society. The peasants, ignorant people, not too sophisticated, look at the Jews and they say to themselves, wait a second, we're going to walk such a distance to redeem the Holy Sepulchre from the infidels who took over it. What about the infidels, the Jews that we see here, the heretics, the people who crucified Jesus? That's what they were told in churches on Sunday sermons. We should eradicate them first, shouldn't we? And indeed, that's exactly what happens. The peasants present an ultimatum to the Jews along the way. You either become Christians, you baptize, or you die. This way or the other. You must decide. And the Jews refuse to convert, obviously. And what happens next is a real tragedy. Entire communities, thousands and thousands of Jews, some say about 12,000 people, are exterminated in Europe on May, July 1096. In places like Speyer, the city of Worms, the city of Mainz, Regensburg, and other places too. Jews are slaughtered. Men, women, children, babies, no mercy is shown. These are the famous pogroms of the year 1096 in Germany. From a historical perspective, it's quite compelling to look at the bigger picture. We're talking about the beginning of the second millennium. The second millennium begins with the slaughter of Jews, with pogroms in Germany. And we all know how the second millennium ended in the 20th century with the Jewish Holocaust. The peasants eventually arrive in Constantinople. Constantinople is the capital of the Byzantines. It's on the way to the Holy Land. There, they have to cross the Bosporus Straits to get to the Muslim territories. They actually get a free ride because the emperor of the Byzantine Empire sees them. He immediately understands these are not the people he wanted, so he basically supplies them with ships, with boats, whatever he could, to transfer them to the territory of the Muslims. Once they land in the Muslim territories, they finally meet a real Muslim army, and obviously they are immediately defeated and crushed down. That was the end of the Peasants' Crusade. Is the Peasants' Crusade part of the First Crusade? I'm not so sure. Some scholars would say, yes, it is. I think it should be distinguished from the main course of events, because when the Peasants' Crusade is over, the real crusade, the First Crusade, is about to begin.